Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of the bourbons. All right, I can't be too loud. My wife is in a meeting next door and stuff like that, so I'm gonna try and keep this a little bit on the muted side while we wrap up our explanation about this guy that we started talking about in class. That I promised fifth period that I would give another explanation of why he's such a leave my sock alone. So now why he's such a big deal. Sorry, talking to the dog. Now the biggest thing that you have to understand is we are talking yet again about the rise of the Bourbon dynasty in France, which is going to lead to the rise. Give me my sock. That is going to lead to the rise of Louis the 14th, King of France, right? The guy that Louisiana is named after. The guy that is the ultimate absolutist. You telling me a secret? Is it like the guy that is the ultimate absolutist who will actually rain down his supreme authority onto the people of France? So look, going into it, what we have to understand is this entire time though, when we've been talking, leave my sock alone. This entire time we've been talking about the Bourbons and Catherine de Medici and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre and the Valois and all that stuff. It's trying to show you that when one domino falls, it's going to end up leading to another major event, right? Henry IV's rise and marriage into the Valois family is super important because he, of course, is the grandfather of Louis XIV, right? He is the rise of the Bourbons. He actually is the Bourbon Street is named after, okay? And his entire ascension into the throne and that old wedding is going to be really important, right? The other thing that we talked about, though, is Henry IV is going to die, right? So Henry IV, a.k.a. Henry the Great, is going to die. Gets stabbed to death by a crazy, Catholic priest, all right? So he, jumps through his carriage window and stabs him to death. Now, who then rises up is his son, Louis XIII, right? Now, Louis XIII was a very weak and ineffective king, and his mom, Marie de Medici, is going to be the queen regent, but isn't going to be very trusted when it comes to politics and rulership. So instead, it ends up most of the authority in France goes to this guy, right? A figure known as Cardinal Richelieu, right? Cardinal Richelieu is famous in not only history, but he's also even famous in fiction. He is the villain in the Three Musketeers movie, and also book and written by Alexandre Dumas. But the thing that you need to understand is that Cardinal Richelieu was the chief minister of France while Louis XIII was busy doing two things. One, being a very weak and ineffective king, and two, focusing on trying to have a son, right? He got married to this woman named Anne of Austria, and they are so hard focusing on trying to have a child, right? Because they keep having miscarriages and birth complications and stuff like that, and so they end up actually not having a viable child for quite some time. They will eventually, but while they're trying to figure this out, Cardinal Richelieu will be the one who leads over France. And the actions that Cardinal Richelieu does is going to be the foundation for why Louis XIV has so much power, right? Now remember, he is the chief minister of France. He is going to try to reignite violence against the Huguenots, right? The same thing that happened with Catherine de Medici and stuff like that. Those Protestant nobles and figures during the French Wars of Religion. He also is going to put spies in the noble courts because his ruling aggressive authority is going to lead to multiple assassination attempts, and literally his spies will prevent some of these assassins from ever getting to him, right? He's going to lead France during the 30 Years' War, and I showed you that map and stuff like that during class, showing you that actually the reason why he hated the Habsburgs so much and decided to involve France in the 30 Years' War is because the Habsburg family, after Charles V split them in half, is going to actually control the Holy Roman Empire on the eastern border of France and Spain on the western border of France, fencing them in. So he is going to use the French, the French military and the massive French prowess to try and wound the Habsburg family. But now this is the biggest and most important thing, where it says created the intendant system down there. You should have that highlighted, starred, underlined 100 times, right? The reason why is because the intendant system that he creates will be one of the biggest reasons why Louis XIV, the absolutist of France, is going to have so much extreme power, okay? And the reason why is because of what it does, all right? So before we even talk about what the intendant system is, this is my re-explanation for fifth period, right? Because I don't want to make them upset. You have to understand that there were two groups involved, okay? There were the kings of France, but then there were these other people, okay? And these other people were referred to as parlements, right? Parlement is spelled Parlement, right? Parlement, which looks a lot like parliament, which is very annoying and frustrating, is a French council that's in each of the provinces, okay, of France, okay? Like, so they are all these little, like, states and provinces that are fenced off, mostly based on, like, noble lands and things like that. And each of them have what's called a parlement, right? And what would happen is the king would write a law, right? Or, like, excuse me, a king would issue a law, like Louis the 13th or Henry the 4th would issue a law. The parlement's job was then to take that law, write it into law, and distribute it throughout their province, right? Now, the thing about it that you have to understand is this system created another, like, kind of a power imbalance that gave the nobles some authority. The nobles are then going to choose sometimes to write the law or to not write the law based on how much they do or don't like the king. Now, with that, though, you have to understand that doesn't sound very absolute. And Cardinal Richelieu is mainly making it his job and his goal in his existence to give as much authority to the monarchy and to the people that work for him as possible, right? So what he creates instead is this thing known as the intendant system. And intendants are individuals, people that are placed within the provinces of France that directly represent the king, and with the aid of the new printing press will issue laws at the king's will, right? So the intendants basically leapfrog the old parlements and put them out of their power structure, right? Now, with this, though, it will create a foundation that leads to the rise of this guy. Well, first of all, he's little right there. That right there, that little chubby baby that is actually going to be the child of Louis the 13th and Anne of Austria. When they finally have a kid, they name him Louis Dudon. This is the child they were focused on having while Cardinal Richelieu was trying to rule for Louis the 13th. Louis Dudon in French means the gift of God. So I should call you Pierre Dudon. So now going into it, though, Louis Dudon will rise up, become king of France at the age of 4 when his father dies. He will become a trained ballet dancer by the age of like 9 or 10, and he will eventually rise to become what is known as Louis XIV, aka the Sun King, right? Because we have to talk now about the absolute ruler at his best. But let's go ahead and clip in this old flip. Watch this. Answer the questions at the end of the flip, okay? I know this is crazy, but y'all had a snow day the last couple days, which is absolutely wild. Never thought I would say that in the New Orleans area, but I can't wait to see you guys soon, and I can't wait to talk to you about what you did on your snow day and how much fun y'all had and how crazy it was and stuff like that. I'm not gonna lie, I don't mind a snow day in New Orleans. It's not so dirty and gross because there's no salt on the roads and stuff like that. But we're gonna talk about that stuff when I see y'all soon. So watch the rest of this flip, answer the questions on the Google form at the end. I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one. Time he hits about this age in his teens, he feels as though he can't trust the nobles anymore. And he doesn't even realize the power that he has, right? And this right here is a famous painting of him actually playing Apollo as one of his favorite characters to play in a lot of his different, ballets, right? And so Louis Dudon, though, is going to then become, one day, Louis the 14th. Also known as the Sun King, because one day when he was inside of his palace, he was performing a ballet like as Apollo, right? And the light from the stage was lighting up the faces of the nobles who were adoringly watching him in all of his greatness and power dance during this play. And he was like, wow, I am the light for my people. This man is so arrogant, and he loved his legs with a fury and a passion because he would put them in every single one of his portraits, but he grows up to become known as the Sun King, right? Who is such a famous figure that literally places like things like in New Girl, right? With like what's her face? Zooey Deschanel, that great show that has Schmidt in it and stuff like that. Even makes references to him. Like, check this out.
You have to grovel. I hate groveling. I would have lasted 2 seconds in the court of the Sun King. I think about that all the time.
You do?
Do you know how much I grovel on a daily basis?
Exactly. You wouldn't last a day in the court of the Sun King, right? So we need to understand, though, he is an absolute ruler at its best. And you can see his absolute authority in particular in a thing that he built when he was a very young man. Starting in the late 1600s, when he was literally only still in his teens, they decide that he hates the nobles now so much that he needs to separate himself from them. So he actually moves out of Paris, which is bananas to actually move out of your capital city, to his own palace now. A palace that is now known famously as the Palace of Versailles, right? The Palace of Versailles that's built 13 miles outside of Paris, which is actually a very far distance, about a 6-hour walk, give or take. And why does he do this? To separate himself from the people of Paris so he can rule absolutely outside in the outskirts of Paris. This building, y'all, right here, which goes from here to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, is a massive complex that has over 700 different rooms, 1,200 fireplaces, over 2,000 pieces of furniture that most of them have gold on them. And then also, look at these fountains right here. The fountains are like literally the size of football fields. They're 100 yards long. Some of y'all are like, there's no way they're that big. Y'all, that right there is that right there, where'd you go? That's a person. Now look at the fountain, right? So yeah, the fountains are huge. They're literally the size of football fields, right? The gardens are huge and cover several hundred square acres. So also what you need to understand as well, the palace was so big that literally the king himself would have to eat his dinner cold every night because it took that long to get the meal from the kitchen to him, right? And so this thing, if you walk from one wing to the other, it's a third of a mile, and it's got 3 different floors. So you end up, if you walk the complex, you walk a mile just indoors, right? Which is absolutely bananas. That right there is the Golden Gate to actually get inside of the palace itself. That's the second one. It's not even the first one. The first one actually got ripped down by a bunch of angry women during the French Revolution, which we'll talk about that a little bit later on. These are the emblems of the Sun King that are actually on that gate outside. This right here is the Court du Mob, which is actually where all the nobles would roll up in their carriages on top of Italian marble floors and literally be greeted by this gigantic piece of architecture, right? By the way, the style of this architecture is known as Baroque architecture, right? Because Baroque is supposed to be the highest of the high end of things at the time. It's the Catholic Church coming back ever since the Protestant Reformation, and it also is supposed to be a triumphant peak in all of artistic things, right? Like, you can't just do a thing of angels. You got to do the angels at their biggest moment, right? And so, I also think that Baroque architecture is so funny because it's actually referenced in Beauty and the Beast. Check this out.
And as I always say, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
If it's not Baroque, don't fix it. Now, going into it, though, also, this is his bedroom right there, which is it's insane. That's the Queen's bedroom right there. And this place, that right there, though, is where he loved to have his parties. It's known as the Hall of Mirrors. It's got over 300 different mirrors inside of it. They had to lure Venetians away from Italy to make the mirrors for them. And it could fit 2,000 people inside of it. It's where he loved to have his parties, right? And that right there is the Jardins of Versailles, the Gardens of Versailles, right? This massive complex, though, represents his absolute power. But politically speaking, how did this man pull this whole thing off? Well, let's go ahead and watch this real quick, and I'll see y'all soon when I'm back in class, all right? Y'all check this out. Louis XIV is a very, very serious thing, right? First and foremost, he did what is known as ruled from home, right? The Palace of Versailles was the centralized location of his throne, his energy, and also of his absolute reign that occurred in France, right? The eminence himself, well, not the eminence, the red eminence is called Richelieu, as we know. The Sun King himself ruled completely from the halls of the Palace of Versailles, and the establishment of this thing known as his royal court, right? His royal court, of course, okay, when you're talking about court and court life, royal courts is basically the large group of nobles that he would keep basically begging at his feet, right? So a big thing about it in general is court or court life has to do going back to the Renaissance era and how nobles and rich, wealthy people would do what's known as hold court, right? Holding court, of course, referring to the idea of people coming to a rich person's home to see them, to party with them, to hang out with music playing in the background, dancing, drinking, and revelry of a sort, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that we talked about this in the Renaissance, right? We talked about Balthasar Castiglione writing the courtier, which is, of course, is a big thing about, being a courtier means you're somebody who can advise a king because you're a part of his court, right? Well, the royal court that Louis XIV constructed inside the Palace of Versailles is actually a massive council of princes and nobles that carried out all of his policies while he lived at his house, right? So he had the ability to talk to all these different princes and nobles that actually lived at his house with him for at least 30% of the year, right? Now, I don't mean that for 2/3 of the year that there was nobody else in there with him. I meant that they were rotating through constantly, right? So there were these nobles that lived at his home with him, right? So if we look at this picture of him right here as well, that right there, of course, is Louis XIV. And look at the cavalcade of nobles that are actually on the stairs watching him address this other noble that is coming before him who happens to be a sword noble, right? So something that you need to understand as well about the growth of French society is that there are two types of noble that existed in France, right? This all actually started with Henry IV, Louis XIV's grandfather, and they actually are what's known as sword nobles and robe nobles, right? Now, sword nobles are former members of the military or nobility that had earned their right, prestige, tradition, honor, and hereditary lands through military service, right? Going back sometimes generations. So we'll talk about one very famous sword noble a little bit later on, a man by the known as the Marquis de Lafayette, which of course the city of Lafayette is of course named after him, right? Now, interesting fact is it was originally known as Vermilionville. Now, going into it though, that sword noble, as you see bowing before the king, they are ones that actually earned those rights through military prestige. They were also the only people in French society that were allowed to carry an open weapon, of course being a sword, that they were allowed to actually carry around with them. Now, a big thing about it, though, is Louis did not particularly like the sword nobles, right? Because those are the people that led the Fronde rebellions against him when he was a very, very young man. He instead actually sold more rights of robe nobility to more people, okay? So what do I mean by selling? That's what makes a robe noble a robe noble. You could buy your way into the nobility, and when you did buy your way into the nobility, you got a break from taxes, you didn't have to pay nearly as much as taxes, and you got hereditary rights and lands, right? And so with that, when you bought your way into the nobility, you could actually be there under his thumb, right? Robe nobles would do anything they could to be closer to Louis, to suck up to him, right? So for example, one of the best jobs you could have as a robe noble is helping him pick out the shirt that he was going to wear, either going to bed or waking up in the morning. Literally, people would stand near his bed, and when he woke in the morning, they would just, oh, clap for him and be like, oh, you're just the best. Look at you waking up. You're the best. Oh my God. They also, apparently, one of the best jobs as well was helping him go to the bathroom or helping him eat or take off his riding boots in the evenings. Literally, the guy would come down the stairs and people would clap for him. Those were the robe nobles that lived at his royal court that would do his bidding and carry out all of his policies, right? Now, another big thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he was an uber Catholic, right? Now, as in uber, as in very extreme. Now, the big thing about it, though, is like, as a very, very strong Catholic, he greatly disliked Huguenots, even though, ironically enough, his grandfather was one. The big thing about it, though, is he actually destroyed Huguenot churches, schools, and tried to force conversion, causing a huge amount of Huguenots to actually leave the country of France and run away. He also is going to do something very, very big and important. He is going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes, the document that said that Huguenots were allowed to practice freely inside of France, is going to be revoked by Louis XIV, even though, again, his grandfather is the one that brought it into power, of course, Henry IV, i.e. Henry the Great, right? So going into it, though, as well, his royal court that existed from him within Versailles is very, very important. And it's basically the epitome of why, or the epitome of why, Louis XIV is considered the absolutist, right? He would force robe nobles to come and watch his ballets. He would force robe nobles to enact his policies. He would use the intendants set up by Cardinal Richelieu to enforce any kind of jurisdictional idea that he wanted to do. Now, how was he able to pay for all this, though, right? So we got to talk about his finances. So the biggest thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he spent basically the entire French budget on his palaces and funding his royal court. Also, he's going to adopt mercantilism, right? Now, mercantilism is very, very important. First of all, it was established by his advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Now, the big thing about it, though, is mercantilism is that key concept of exporting more than you import and hoarding as much money as possible inside of your own country. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his financial advisor and robe noble himself, came up to Louis XIV and said, you have to understand that as Spain grows in liquidity and as they bring in more gold and silver into their borders, as every other country in this area begins to colonize and make more money, we need to do our best effort to try and hold on to as much gold and silver inside of this country as possible. And we need to try and do that by refusing to actually bring in foreign items. We need to actually export more than we import, because if you are exporting, you are receiving payment for an item, whereas if you are importing, you are paying for something. And if I spend $1 and it goes to England, it's going to get melted down and turned into a pound sterling rather than being a franc, right? So the idea, though, that was propagated to him was conserve and hoard as much money inside of the country as possible. That means he's going to increase tariffs, and a big thing as well that's going to happen under Louis XIV is the outlawing of certain foreign products, right? For example, write this down, Louis outlawed English tobacco. He also outlawed English cotton textiles, right? Because he was trying to force French people to buy products from France to keep that money
hoarded inside of his country, right? So mercantilism is a big thing that he adopted that is going to be very, very big in the adoption and the understanding of Louis XIV going forward. He's also eventually going to die at the ripe old age of his 70s with a tremendous amount of debt, right? Having multiple different wives and things like that. But the big thing, not at the same time, but the big thing about it in general is he died mostly with a lot of debt due to the fact that he started more wars than you can imagine. And he was in power for 54 years. 54 years of reign, right? Now, in his 54 years of reign, though, he literally was at war for 33 of them, right? That is absolutely bananas. That's absolutely crazy. The idea that a guy that ruled into his 70s, that died in 1715, literally had that much time and power to lead many different wars. But the problem is he lost a couple on the back end, right? One of the biggest ones he, of course, lost on the back end was this thing called the War of Spanish Succession. Do y'all remember King Carlos II, the ugly Habsburg guy that was the last Habsburg of Spain? When he died, it left an opening on the throne. The person that ended up getting the throne is Louis's grandson, Philip V, right? And so the big thing about it is Louis tried to exert his power, try to grow his holdings, try to gobble up as much land and territory in Spain as possible. The rest of Europe coalesced together, fought against him, and crushed his forces, right? This is going to leave him with a tremendous amount of debt going forward. It's going to help lead into that French Revolution. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take a break right here, and we're going to talk about Russia, okay? So go ahead and give me a nice big title, a nice big fat Russia in your notes so we can talk about this stuff